What's going on, hobby and development fans? Tyler here, and in this video we're going to be talking about photography, light boxes, and just some status updates about the channel and some things we got planned for you. Stick around. So before we begin, I just want to touch on Warhammer 40k Apocalypse, which is going to be coming out pretty soon by the posts that are on the Warhammer 40k face group page. I'm really looking forward to that game. It looks to be, it's probably a good direction for Apocalypse to be going in, to where it can take take what used to be a long, drawn-out process and condense it down into what's essentially a normal gaming day. I personally have just an ungodly amount of points of Tau, so I'm looking forward to be able to field some of those models. Be able to take a bunch of tanks, and I've probably got 100 troops easily. So it'll be nice to be able to field those. It'll give me a reason to save up to buy a Storm Surge, or not a Storm Surge, the Supremacy armor. I'll buy another Storm Surge. I have one, and then it'll be really nice to be able to play with a lot of those models, and it'll be nice to be able to do it in the course of an evening. So I've been reading the posts that they've come out with, and it's looking really cool with the movement trays, how they're designed, because unit coherency in Apocalypse is like a ½ an inch, and that's awfully a precise small distance. So these movement trays keep everything nice and concise and together, where you're moving them around, because you're moving whole units instead of like models in individual units, and it'll keep everything nice and expedient. You don't have to move every like little model as you're going along. Go ahead. I definitely recommend reading through those articles that have come out if Apocalypse is something that might interest you, because it's looking really unique. Damage is resolved at the end of the phase, so that you can bring your most badass models that you got, bring them in, and they're not going to get wiped off the table before you even get a chance to use them. Everybody, you move a detachment at a time, and then you resolve damage at the end of the phase, at the end of the turn, and that way everything gets a chance to be used. So stay tuned for that. I'm definitely gonna be doing some Apocalypse level games. I know a bunch of the guys that I play with have a lot of models that they can field, and the problem now is we just don't have the time in the day to do an Apocalypse, and nobody wants to drag out a game for several days at a time. So it'll be nice to get a game of Apocalypse done in 4 or 5 hours. The other thing that I think is really cool are the tactic cards that they're coming out with. Man, that's going to be, I'm going to have to buy some deck organizers to keep them organized, but I'm really looking forward to that game, man. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to it. So on to the main topic for today, photography. And why is photography important? Because you want to show off those awesome models that you're painting. Like all the models that I paint now, I'm using this Canon G7X PowerShot to use to photograph all my models, and I use a light box as well. And now we'll get into the nitty-gritty of that here in just a moment. So first thing I want to do is actually put a picture up in here of my light box setup. It's on the floor. Don't worry about that. That's the only place that I have for it right now. I'm in the middle of a move. So once I get moved, I'm going to have everything nice set up in a hobby room, and it'll be up off the floor. So that's my light box. And you want a light box if you're going to do miniature photography. And the reason you want a light box is to control your environment where you're taking your pictures. You can make a light box. This one was purchased through Amazon or something like that, but you can make a light box. The key is that one, you have like a curved background, and the reason you want a curved background is because when you're setting your lights up, you don't want harsh angles to create shadows. So you could technically do this if you're making your own light box with like a curved piece of paper. That would work. But in this case, I have different color fabrics. I have a white, black, blue, and red backgrounds. I pretty much use blue and black, or not blue and black, black and white exclusively. And it velcros to the top and it slants down, and that gives me a nice curved surface to be able to take pictures on. Another feature of a light box that you want is you want sort of translucent sides, white sides, like the light box that I have. And the reason that you want that is so that you can diffuse light through it. Now, if you imagine light, we'll get some super creative here. We're going to use my phone, because my phone has a flash on it. And if you can imagine where this flash is, there's a little bit of a lens that scatters it to spread it out. But if you can imagine all this light coming off, all these light rays coming off the light, and then when it hits a model, stand by, I'm gonna go get a model, and voila, through the magic of editing, I've got a Riptide that I'm working on for my Tau army. So if you can imagine the light rays coming off, and they're all going in the same direction, and they're hitting this model, and they're going to create harsh shadows when they hit the model, because they're all coming off the same direction. So what you do when you diffuse light is you breaking up those harsh light rays. So one giant light ray becomes multiple small light rays that are coming out, and then they break up into different angles. And so what that does is it's not as intense light hitting at all the spots. So it's more light covering a larger area, and it's spread out. And the best way that I can describe for you to try this is to take a flashlight and shine it at the wall, and then take a piece of toilet paper or something and just put it over there. And then you can diffuse it more by making it thicker and thicker and thicker. So what that does is it allows you to get even lighting over your model in the light box. And you put a light on each side, that way you're not creating shadows on one side and not shadows on the other. So my light box setup uses 2 LED lights coming from both sides, diffusing it through the sides there, the white sides, and it diffuses it over the model, and it creates a nice even lighting. So then you can set up your camera as close as you can. If you have a mechanical zoom, you use your mechanical zoom as well to get, frame your model nice in your viewfinder, and you create a nice natural scene where the only thing that you're looking at is your model. And that captures a lot of detail, it eliminates a lot of distractions, and it just makes all of your work look beautiful. So we touched a little bit on the light, and we touched a little bit on, getting close to the model and setting up your light box. Now, what can we use to photograph our models? Obviously, a camera, right? You can use tablets, you can use phones. Up until about a month ago, I was using my Note 9. Now I'm using my PowerShot. And you can pretty much use anything. The better the camera that you get, the more detail is going to show up, the larger the image you can make, the crisper it's going to be. But there's nothing wrong with using your smartphone camera. You just have to know your settings. I prefer a more professional camera because you can shoot in RAW, and you can shoot and adjust more of the settings. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So regardless of whatever you use, you get yourself a tripod. I used a cheap little tripod that came with my light box that clipped on both sides of this and allowed it to hold steady when I was using it before I got my professional camera. And then the next thing that you're going to want to consider when you're taking miniature photographs is what angle do you want to position your model. Now, if I'm taking, I usually take multiple angles, but if you're going to use one photo, say to enter the contest, or as the front image that you see for your album, or the main image that you see when you're looking at your model, each model kind of has let's see if I can get my camera to focus properly here. It might not. So each model has an optimal viewing angle, and depending on how you want to set the scene, you kind of get the optimal viewing angle. With this one, it's probably something around there. So it wouldn't make very much sense to make your main picture like this or like this. You're you're not getting all that detail that you want. And so again, with the tripod, you can get that nice steady shot, your optimal viewing angle on your model. And then from there, the first thing that you should check is your focus. I'm going to be speaking in terms of a more professional style camera. I can do it all with this. This is more of a professional style camera on this phone, but also the PowerShot has much more in-depth settings. So your focus, what you're going to do, especially with a camera like my Canon, is take it off of autofocus. You're going to want to adjust that focus to be as precise as possible on specific points of the model. Often the face is going to be the best place for you to focus. So adjust your autofocus or your manual focus if you can, so that it's perfect. Everything is crisp, clear, and in view, and that'll give you a good starting place to adjust the rest of your settings. So after you've designated where your focus on your model is going to be, the next thing, if your camera has this ability, is going to be to adjust the f-stop. What an f-stop is on the camera is it's the aperture of the camera. And if you think of the aperture as in the pupil of an eye, the larger the aperture, the more light is going to be able to enter the camera's lens. Why is this relevant? Without going into a lot of photography terms that's really not necessary to understand how we're going to use our camera, the higher the f-stop, the more of your model is going to be in focus. The lower the f-stop, the more specific of an area is going to be in focus. Why does this matter? So in the model, the example that I'm going to put here, up in this corner, you can see that the whip of the model is slightly out of focus, and that gives more of a depth of field type of a look. Now, when I create the picture for the entire model that displays all of it in detail, I use a higher f-stop to make sure that the entire model is in focus and that you can get an accurate representation of the work as a whole. So if you're going to be taking a picture of the model for like a competition entry and you want all of the detail on the model to be visible, you want a higher f-stop, a higher aperture setting, and that'll allow you to get all of it in detail, in focus. In general, especially if you're using a phone camera, set your f-stop as high as possible. I know my Note 9 only had 2 settings, but my Canon has many more settings. Now do note, the higher your f-stop, the darker the image is going to get. And so that's going to be relevant with the other settings that we're going to be talking about. But start there, make sure that your model is in focus. After you've adjusted the focus and the f-stop to make sure that everything that you want in focus is in focus, the next thing that you need to adjust is your shutter speed and your ISO setting. So ISO is the sensor in your camera, how sensitive that is to light. And the shutter speed is how long the camera is exposing your sensor to the light. What you're trying to do here is you're trying to find a balance of ISO and shutter speed to capture the most detail that you can. The best way to do that is to first start by lowering your ISO to as low as it can go. And what that does is it decreases the amount of light sensitivity that your camera has. And the more sensitive it is to light, the more noise you're going to get, those little grains that appear all over the image. So we eliminate as much of that as we can by first setting our ISO as low as we can. Now, again, make sure that your camera's on a tripod, because this next part is going to be relevant. Because we've made our image so dark by adjusting our f-stop higher and our ISO low, you're going to need a shutter speed, again, the amount of time that your sensor is exposed to light, to be longer, to let more light in, seeming that it's going to be darker because of your f-stop and darker because it's less sensitive. So what you do is you extend your shutter speed maybe 1 to 3 seconds, depending on the type of model that you're shooting. If it's a dark model on a dark background, I usually do, if it's like probably a 2 to 3 second shutter speed. And it's important that you have it on a camera, because when you're taking the picture with an extended shutter speed, any slight movement or vibration is going to make a blurry image. So to make it crisp, set it on a tripod. If you have a camera like the Canon, you can set a delay. So after I press the press the button to take the picture. It's a 2-second delay before it takes the picture. That way I can move my hand away and the camera stabilizes. On my Samsung, I used the stylus as kind of a remote to get that done. And so that's in general how you're taking pictures with the cameras. Now the cameras have a couple of tools that can help us judge if we're underexposing or overexposing our model. And what do I mean by that? Overexposing our model means that we have our brights are too bright, and it's overwhelming that particular area of the photo. Underexposing is our darks are too dark. So we want to try to find a happy medium. And the best way that we can know, don't trust your screen. It can be deceiving. It can show things that are not technically how it's gonna turn out in the image. There's a little section at the bottom of your camera, if you're using one that has this, that's going to have some numbers, 1, 2, 3, and then -1, 2, and 3, and 0 right in the middle. And 0 in the middle is perfect even exposure. I like to overexpose my images just by a little bit when I'm using a black background, and the opposite when I'm using a white background, and then I go in later and I edit the photos to adjust and get the way that I want to adjust. But you'll notice that you're getting the best exposure that you can if you've aligned that. There's a little marker underneath it, and if you've aligned it right underneath the 0. Also, if your camera has a histogram, it looks like a chart. It's usually, if you're looking at your camera, it's going to be up here. It kind of floats around up there, and a histogram. And on the far left side of the histogram, if you have a spike, it means that a lot of your model is very dark. And if you have spikes in other areas, it means that your model is very light. So farthest to the left on your histogram is what's called shadow clipping, and farthest on the right is highlight clipping. And what that means is it's so dark on this side, or it's so bright on this side, that you're losing a lot of the detail. Now it's going to depend on what type of a background you're using. If I use a black background, I get shadow clipping on my histogram. That's completely normal. All that is doing is your camera is telling you that, hey, a lot of this photo is black. I don't know if it should be that way. Same if I use a white background, I'm gonna get in the back on the far right, it's gonna say, hey, there's a lot of brightness on this model or on this photo. Are you sure it should be this way? So use your best judgment when you're looking at your histogram to determine what settings should be adjusted. And in general, that's pretty much what I use the histogram for. You can, of course, if you're going to be doing more extensive photography, look up what the center sections of the histograms are for. But in general, that's what I use it for. We're only talking about very close-up photography here. So again, I mostly use that bar on the bottom, the 1, 2, 3, -1, 2, 3, to determine my exposure levels. So the next thing we're going to talk about is metering. And what metering is it's telling the camera what part of the image should I use to collect all this data that the camera, is using to determine the exposure levels and the color correction and the white balance and all that good stuff. So in general, there are 3 types of metering that most of your cameras are going to have: matrix, center weighted, and spot. I'm going to touch on what each of them are, but for the purposes of miniature photography, mostly you're going to use center weighted or spot. I tend to use center weighted because I'm getting in closer to my models, but again, spot is another option. You generally don't want to be using matrix metering, and now I'll explain why. So matrix metering is taking the entire image, and it's kind of taking the average of everything in there to determine your exposure levels. And that's relevant if you're taking a picture outside or inside of like a big general scene. Nothing in particular is standing out of the model, like there's not a person in there smiling or whatnot. And there's the center weighted. Center weighted is exactly what it sounds like. It's metering the center portion of your image about like this. And what that's doing is it's just taking that area and ignoring the rest of the area when it's determining what to take the average of for exposure and white balance and whatnot. And spot is similar, but you can have, that's where you touch the camera, like, okay, I want it to focus over here type of a thing. Spot metering is it's a spot on the camera that it's taking that information from. Now you want to use center weighted if you, ideally in miniature photography, because you're not just using like one single spot on the model to take all this information from. You generally want a few spots on the model, but the model should be in the center of your image anyways. So I tend to use center weighted, but spot is also another option. Play around with it, see what works better for you. Kind of stay away from matrix metering. White balance I usually set to auto, and any of the issues with white balance we can fix after. And I just want to make sure that if your camera has the ability to do the following, make sure that it can. Always shoot in RAW if you can. So what RAW is it's a raw image file. It's taking all of the information that the camera captures from the sensor and it stores it in the file. That way you have the most ability to later on go in and affect changes in like Adobe or Paint.net is what I personally use, and adjust all those parameters. So you get more adjustments with a raw image file. If you can't shoot in RAW, I know, fortunately this phone, the Note 9, can shoot in RAW in Pro mode. The Canon obviously can shoot in RAW. You just get so much more correction, and then normal JPEG doesn't do that. So if you can shoot in RAW, and then go in later and make those setting changes. And the last thing that I want to touch on is the program to use to edit. Now, I personally don't have a favorite program as far as if you want to subscribe to Adobe. The reason I don't is because I don't want to pay a monthly fee to use the program like this. I'm a one and done type of person. That being said, I'm currently using Paint.net, and you can download the ability to edit RAW files. Generic Paint.net can't, but there's some plugins that you can download that will allow you to do it. Just some of the adjustments before I sign out that I wanted to let everybody know. This is good adjustments to mess with. I usually adjust the brightness and contrast a little bit. If I overexposed an image by a little bit, I might adjust the brightness down, the contrast up, just to match what I feel will present best. After I adjust the brightness and the contrast, the next thing that I usually do is adjust the sharpness to make the model pop, I guess is the term that I want to use, to the edges to show just a little bit more. And then I go in and I reduce the noise if there's any noise in the model, if I had to use a higher ISO setting for some reason. And then after that, I usually render the image. You can adjust hue and saturation, you can adjust curves, the levels if you're more of an advanced user. But if you're just starting out with miniature photography, kind of stay away from those. You're going to misrepresent the type of image that you've taken. The last thing that I may have said the last thing was the Paint program, but it's just me talking. I like to hear myself talk, I guess. Anyways, so a couple of just troubleshooting ideas. I had this experience. I was taking an image of the demon prince with the herald on his back, and I was struggling with the settings. I was constantly getting an overexposed image because he had a lot of bright white skin. So what I found to correct that is you back off your lighting farther away from what you're getting it diffused, and that'll help spread out your light rays a little bit. I was finding that no matter what settings that I adjusted on my image or on my camera, it was still washing out the end picture. And the opposite can happen if you have your lights too far away on a darker image. If you find that you take a picture of a brighter model and it's washed out, probably because you have a white background. Try switching to a black background. If you have too dark of a model, obviously don't use it on a dark background. That's pretty much it that I can think of. Molly's over here sleeping. Excuse the mess everywhere in the process of moving. So she's not up on my lap today. What do you think, Molly? You say hi to all the YouTube fans. Not impressed, are you? Boop. All right. We'll call it a day. Again, I've got some projects coming up once I get the move complete. I'm going to be doing some more comic book style. I've got a new type of comic book style that I'm going to experiment with, and we'll get that on video. And then a couple of people have mentioned that they'd like to see comic book painting in a white style for the Tau units. And I know exactly how I'm going to do that. I'm not going to give it away because it is something that I'm planning and that I want to do. I will be moving on the 26th. So after the 26th, I'm going to start recording all that stuff again. Currently everything's in boxes, and it's hard for me not to get that painting itch and scratch it because everything's put away. So until then, I'll be playing Fortnite like a antisocial human being and editing this video and getting it up there for you. Enjoy the hobby, play fair, paint well, and now take good photos, and see you in the next video.